The Black Lion Inn in Hammersmith in London is said to be haunted by a couple of ghosts. Now, there is nothing unusual about that. You would find it harder to find a pub in Britain that isn't haunted than one that is. They all have ghosts lurking around. Pubs, and especially historic pubs, are favourite hangouts for British ghosts. What's unusual about this one is the famous and very complicated and very sad story behind one of the apparent hauntings. This involves a hoaxer pretending to be a ghost, a tragic death, and a murder inquiry held within the pub itself. The subsequent trial exposed a gap in English law that was not filled until 1984. This is the story of the Hammersmith Ghost. If you're new here, hi, I'm Juliet. I'm a writer and historian, and on this channel I cover myth, legend, folklore, ghost stories, and weird and wonderful history in general. Let's get into it! There are apparently two ghosts haunting the Black Lion Inn. One of them isn't relevant to the rest of this story, so I'll just describe it really briefly. There is a long room at the back, which used to be the Skittle Alley. Skittles was a really popular game in pubs in Britain for many, many centuries and is still played in some places today. It's basically a bit like 10-pin bowling, a little bit smaller, and with only 9 pins. And in the long room, which I think is the old Skittle Alley, if I'm reading this right, a barmaid one morning saw a pretty young girl in an Alice in Wonderland style dress skipping along the centre aisle, but when she went to have a closer look, the room was empty. This ghost really doesn't appear to have anything to do with the rest of this story, but since I am talking about hauntings at the Black Lion Inn, it's worth mentioning. The other ghost story associated with the modern pub is very, very brief, but potentially connected to a much longer and more complicated tale. Staff have often heard strange, anxious footsteps pacing back and forth across the upper floor. In 2004, landlord Kevin Sheehy told the BBC that there were some strange goings-on in the pub. He said the chef lives upstairs and has been woken up half a dozen times by someone speaking his name, but there was no one there. That's about it for the stories of the actual ghostly activity happening now, modern stories. But this pub is the centrepiece of the story of the Hammersmith Ghost, a series of events from 1803 and 1804, which are much longer and more complicated, and which may or may not involve an actual ghost, but which certainly do involve a lot of people and some tragic choices. Hammersmith is now a part of London. It is in Zone 2 on the tube, on the underground system, so it's not right in the middle of central London, but it is not particularly far out. However, back in 1803, Hammersmith was a village outside of London, very nearby, but outside. It's close to the River Thames, and the Hammersmith Bridge across the Thames, which connected it much more closely with the city, was built later in 1817. After the bridge was built, the city then spread out to reach Hammersmith by the end of the Georgian era. So these events took place right at the end of Hammersmith's life as a village, before it became subsumed by the City of London. Although it now has several churches, the Times report from 1804 refers to the churchyard, implying a single church. This would be the Anglican Church of St. Paul's, Church of England Church of St. Paul's. The Church of England Church of St. Peter's was built later, and then obviously other churches for other denominations are later as well. We have quite the cast of characters involved in this tragic tale. First of all, let's start with the victim, Thomas Millward, who was a bricklayer who was tragically killed, and his murder is at the centre of the eventual court case. The usual working dress for a bricklayer in this period was white trousers and a white jacket, potentially with a white apron and white shoes. And this, you may not be surprised to hear, is going to be relevant. Other characters involved in this story include his sister, Anne Millward, Francis Smith, the murderer, a tax collector, and these are real people, and I really, should be respectful in talking about them. Every time I think of Francis Smith as one of the characters involved in this story, all I can hear in my head is the lyrics from Hamilton, Aaron Burr going, "I'm the damn fool who shot." Anyway, also involved John Locke, a wine merchant and a friend of Francis Smith, George Stowe, a friend of Locke, a shoemaker called John Graham, a group of Graham's apprentices who are unnamed, the coroner, George Hodgson, Thomas Flynn, a clerk who died several years earlier in 1800, we'll see what he has to do with everything shortly, and finally the night watchman, William Girdler, and the High Constable of Hammersmith, William Brooks. These events took place before the formation of the Metropolitan Police, which is usually cited as the world's first modern police force. There were the beginnings of the history of police a little bit earlier. The Bow Street Runners had been formed to kind of go look for crime and bring people to justice in the mid-18th century. And the Glasgow Police was formed in 1800, along with the Thames Water Police, which was partly aimed at finding smugglers. But modern policing really kind of comes into force, that's a terrible pun, with the Metropolitan Police, who are formed in 1829 by Home Secretary Robert Peel, hence their old nicknames of Bobbies or Peelers. In this period, the night watchmen and the constables were at the forefront of criminal justice in Britain. The night watchman patrolled the streets with a lantern and a rattle, calling out the time and the weather. He also had a staff or a club that he might use to poke drunks and get them out of doorways. He would make a noise with the rattle in order to alert people that he was coming, again, kind of drunks, keep peace on the streets, get people out of the way. And obviously he would have a lantern because he's patrolling the streets at night, and most streets in this period do not have streetlights yet. Some of them were private. William Girdler was a private night watchman, according to the Times, which presumably means some kind of local wealthy person or landowner has paid for them. Others were hired by the town authorities. Constables were chosen from the men of the parish. The parish is the area, now it refers to the area served by the local church, and it essentially does still have that meaning in the 18th and 19th centuries, but the parish is also a kind of political area with the church at its centre, the Church of England church at its centre. Your parish is your kind of local community. Constables were chosen from men in the parish and served for a year as constable. It was their job to arrest people and take them before a magistrate. So when somebody was arrested, they would be taken in front of a magistrate, and the magistrate would then decide whether they should go to a criminal trial. This would involve, is the crime serious enough? Is there enough evidence to suggest that it is worth, putting them on trial? Is there enough evidence to go ahead with a trial? And that kind of thing. And this is still the case today in British law, that somebody accused of a crime will go before a magistrate before going to a trial. If someone witnessed a crime, it was their duty to advise the watchman or the constable of the offence, and then it was the duty of all the men to catch the offender and bring them to justice. This involved raising a hue and cry, a practice that was eventually abolished later in the 19th century with the advent of modern policing. Basically, you would run around the parish yelling really loudly, usually yelling out the crime, so yelling theft or violence or fire. Fire obviously might not be a crime. You would also yell this if there was a fire. But you would yell out the crime, and then it was the duty of all the men of the parish to come out and help catch the criminal and bring them before the magistrate. So William Girdler's job as night watchman was to patrol the streets at night and keep the peace. And then William Brooks' job as the High Constable of Hammersmith was to arrest people and bring them before a magistrate to decide if they should stand trial. By January 1804, Hammersmith was full of rumours of a ghost that had been terrorising the locals for the past 2 months. It jumped out at people walking through the streets at night, it broke the windows of houses, an old lady had apparently seen the ghost and her mind never recovered. Locals, especially women, were becoming afraid to go out after 5 p.m. This is taking place, of course, across November, December and January, so it's dark by like 3:30, 4 o'clock. At that time of year. We're covering the darkest point of the year in this story. At first, most sightings tended to be around the churchyard, and the ghost's main distinguishing feature was that it was white, or wearing white. It was a white figure. Stories about ghosts wearing white or looking or appearing white start to appear quite early in European ghost folklore because medieval ghosts were often thought of as being wrapped in the shroud they had been buried in. Sometimes medieval ghost stories are more about revenants than ghosts. They have more of a physical form, and they will often be kind of like a zombie or a revenant wearing their funeral shroud. So that led to a trope of ghosts wearing white that then continued for many years after. There are also various separate traditions of ghosts wearing white, particularly women wearing white. In Britain, in Wales, the figure of Eladi Wen, I'm not pronouncing that very well, sorry, Uladiwen. Anyway, the white woman, the white lady, is a common feature in folklore around Wales in particular, and there are other stories of ghostly women in white from around the world, which I've actually already done a video on, so I'll link that below. Although the ghost usually wore white, on the 15th of December it apparently appeared in front of a group of servants from a brew house wearing the hide of a calf with large horns and cloven feet. It seized the drayman, which is the man who drives the cart to deliver the beer, by the throat and nearly choked him, and the fright sent him into a fever. The man was called Thomas Groom, and he later testified in court. Going through the churchyard between 8 and 9 o'clock with my jacket under my arm and my hands in my pocket, when some person came from behind a tombstone, which there are 4 square in the yard, behind me, and caught me fast by the throat with both hands and held me fast. My fellow servant who was going on before, hearing me scuffling, asked what was the matter. Then whatever it was gave me a twist round and I saw nothing. I gave a bit of a push out with my fist and felt something soft like a great coat. About a week later, the driver of a stagecoach heard a rustling noise and saw a strange creature dressed in white gliding over a nearby meadow. When it came near, he saw it had bladders fixed to its feet, shoulders, arms, body and head, making a rattling noise. I'm assuming by bladders we're talking about like the type of pig's bladder you would use for a football, I guess. The Times doesn't really specify beyond bladders, but I would imagine that's what he means. And he also describes it making a rattling noise like a watchman's rattle. Obviously that could be a watchman's rattle, although it's not William Girdler. The coachman ran off into town, and when he came back with more men, they found the coach's ropes cut and the horses grazing in a nearby field. The passengers apparently hadn't done anything, they just sat around the whole time. From that point, the ghost appeared in the churchyard every evening. The churchyard is about half a mile from town and near to the road. On Monday the 2nd of January, the ghost was seen chasing a young woman who apparently shrieked dreadfully, according to the Times. 4 male passengers were passing in a stagecoach, but none of them stopped or got out to help. You can hear the judgment of the writer of the Times piece when he describes that. The Times also adds that on some unspecified date, a heavily pregnant woman, the wife of a labourer, had encountered the ghost walking through the graveyard at night. She'd been visiting friends and family in Brook Green. The ghost chased her and grabbed hold of her, and she fainted and was found in the graveyard by friends hours later. Many versions of this story then say that she took to her bed and died. I think it is important to say that what the Times, in their report on January 6th, 1804, actually says is her life is despaired of. That is not the same as saying she died. That is saying they think she is going to die, not that she died. And then later versions of this story constantly repeat the assertion that she died. So this does not seem likely to me. I think she's fainted. And then maybe had to kind of, been ill and had to rest up. But there's actually no reason to think that she died. If she did later pass away, probably nothing to do with the ghost. Jacob Middleton, in his book on this subject, adds that it was probably not even something that actually happened, that she'd only had a fright, and that it wasn't even the ghost that frightened her, according to an investigation carried out by Kirby's Wonderful and Scientific Museum later in 1804. While all this was going on, there were also several instances of people being mistaken for the mysterious ghost who had nothing to do with whatever was going on whatsoever. Near the end of 1803, at the end of December, a publican had seen a ghostly figure when walking past the church at night, which turned out to be a male servant in female clothes. He was teasing a female servant he worked with by wearing her clothes and pretending to be the ghost, according to him, by way of frolic, which is a wonderful way to say for shits and giggles. If you want to say for shits and giggles like a 19th century person, like a Regency person, you can say by way of frolic instead. Another time, a chimney sweep called Brazier had seen a white figure in the churchyard at night and yelled, "Ghost!" Went into the graveyard swinging a stick until he hit it, and it turned out to be a young woman and a young man in the graveyard in the dark. And I think we can all guess what they were doing. Graveyards have always been used for that. There's a lot of handy things to hide behind, especially if it's dark. And unsurprisingly, one man who had twice been mistaken for the ghost was Thomas Millwood, the bricklayer. One night in December, a gentleman and two ladies were passing in a carriage and Millwood was walking along the road in his work clothes, and the man shouted, "There goes the ghost!" Millwood threatened to punch him. And this was the second time he'd been mistaken for the ghost in the few weeks, at which point his mother-in-law told him he really should wear a coat after dark because his work clothes were white and people were mistaking him for the ghost simply because he was wearing white clothes. And she tried to tell him, put a dark coat on over your clothes. It's winter anyway, how he wasn't cold, I don't know. Naturally, there were a few different explanations floating around for what was going on. Some people thought it was a living woman who was mentally unwell, a mad woman in their vocabulary, and was wearing strange clothes. Partly because of the strange behaviour, presumably because of the kind of wandering around the churchyard at night. This was the theory for some people. Some people thought it was just a living person who was being a public nuisance, a creeper who is deliberately frightening people, which does seem like the most likely explanation for most of this. And this was naturally a very popular understanding of what's going on with the ghost, to the point where a group of respected local gentlemen actually offered a reward for £10, which was a lot of money back then, for the capture of anyone pretending to be the ghost. According to Edwin Valentine Mitchell, writing in 1926, there was another theory. Now, Mitchell is writing more than 100 years later, so it's hard to tell how much this is accurate because it's not really mentioned in the Times reports or many of the kind of sources close to the time. Mitchell was writing a book called The Newgate Calendar, which is all about people held in Newgate prison. So his interest in it sparks from Francis Smith eventually being held in Newgate prison after the murder. But Mitchell says that the report was that it was the apparition of a man who had cut his throat in the neighbourhood above a year ago. This was actually something that had happened 3 or 4 years earlier. We're right on the edge of 1803, beginning of 1804, about 3.5 years earlier. It happened in summer 1800. Basically, because the death of this man, Thomas Flynn, was so dramatic, Mitchell says people thought that that must be the ghost, because usually in ghost folklore, ghosts have died violently or have some kind of unfinished business, or they're not buried properly. There's some reason that they're haunting, and the violent death and improper burial both applied to Thomas Flynn. Flynn was an Irishman working in Bishopsgate who was separated from his wife, who was a local from Hammersmith. So she had gone back home to live with her parents. Flynn was violent and his wife had gone to the magistrates to what was called swear the peace against him. This is basically the 19th century equivalent of a restraining order, that she gets the magistrates to order him to stay away from her. The family had actually moved across Hammersmith trying to escape Flynn, who kept pursuing his wife, even though she had used all her resources to try and get away from him. On the 1st of August 1800, he found their new address and started harassing them and threatening to kill them all with a penknife. The next morning, he broke into the house, and when his wife refused to go with him, he hit her several times with the poker from the fireplace. Flynn thought he had killed her, and at that point he rushed out into the street, tried to stab himself in the stomach with a knife, and then cut his own throat with a razor. Both of them were taken to St George's Hospital in Hyde Park. Mrs Flynn was very seriously injured, but thankfully she did eventually recover. Flynn took 2 days to die, writing letters to friends and family. I think he had tried to cut his own throat with something that was good enough to do the job, but not very well, rather small, not very sharp blade. He did eventually die, and the coroner ordered that Flynn should be denied Christian burial and be buried under the highway. In this period, the strict rules relating to not burying people who had taken their own life in the churchyard had started to be relaxed. So earlier in the medieval and early modern period, anybody who took their own life was not allowed to be buried in consecrated ground around a church because it was considered a mortal sin, and still is in the Catholic Church. And Flynn was, of course, Catholic, he's Irish. By the time we get to 1800, these rules, particularly in the Church of England, are not as strict as they were, and often people who had taken their own life would be put kind of on the edge of the churchyard instead. But in Flynn's case, obviously it's complicated by the fact that he's been violent and abusive, he's nearly killed his wife before then killing himself, so there's more to it than just the fact that he took his own life. So he's given essentially the same sort of burial that you would give a vampire in Eastern Europe. He's buried under the crossroads and staked, which is supposed to stop any after-death activity. So a lot of people thought that the ghost was a real ghost rather than somebody dressing up, and that it was the angry spirit of Thomas Flynn. And we're getting into the period where ghosts are starting to be more of a translucent thing, but there's presumably still some of the old stories that are more the revenant type hanging around. We've also got the early kind of vampire folklore moving over from Eastern Europe to Britain around the same time. This is around the time that stories about vampires start to become popular in Britain. So presumably there is a sense that a ghost is not necessarily insubstantial, that they might have a physical form. And earlier on, the ghost had often been seen around the churchyard, and Flynn had been buried not in the churchyard, but in the crossroads, so not too far from the churchyard because the church is near the road. However, as time went on, there started to be more sightings of the ghost in a different location. It started to be seen quite often around Beaver Lane and Black Lion Lane, which is further into the village between the Great West Road and the river. Particularly about 1 a.m, the ghost started to be seen in this area. These roads had a few scattered houses and lots of trees and high hedges. Activity around this area escalated a bit on the 29th of December. William Girdler was coming out of one of the houses after visiting somebody when he met one of John Graham's apprentices, the shoemaker, and the apprentice was absolutely terrified. Girdler then saw a white shrouded figure standing by a water pump and gave chase, which is his job as the night watchman, even if he's not on duty. The figure removed the white clothing, or whatever it was that it had been wearing, shoved it under a coat and ran off into the night. Girdler then went into a nearby pub, which happened to be the White Hart, to ask around, and several more people saw this ghost, or person wearing white, lurking around the area that night. Francis Smith was at the time renting a home next door to the White Hart. He was lodging next to the White Hart. So Smith decided to spend the next few nights going out looking for the ghost, and he brought with him his shotgun, which he used for shooting pigeons. This would shoot birdshot, a spray of small pellets. That's the kind of type of gun that he's using, but he decides to take it out and go looking for the ghost. Now, he always insists that his intention was to shoot a ghost. We have to assume that he either is thinking it's a revenant type ghost, he might think it's some kind of demon. Protestant theology often suggests that ghosts are not the spirits of dead people, but rather demons in disguise. So he might think it's some kind of demon. If he thinks it's a person, then even if they are creating a public nuisance, shooting them is a bit extreme. It's also possible he didn't expect to kill anybody with the type of gun he was using. But the story took a tragic turn on the night of January 3rd, 1804. Smith was out looking for the ghost with his fowling gun, or pigeon shooting gun. William Girdler was on duty as night watchman that night, so Smith told Girdler what he was doing, and they arranged to meet later, and they arranged that if they came across each other in the dark, one of them would shout, "Who goes there?" and the other would reply, "A friend." Obviously, again, not much in the way of street lighting. This is still a village outside the city. City of London had streetlights by this point, but not a village outside of it. Very dark, winter, possibly foggy, and very, very narrow streets, so you can't see very well. Smith was coming down Cross Lane, which was a narrow tree-lined track connecting Beaver Lane with Black Lion Lane, which is where the Millwoods lived. Anne Millwood, Thomas Millwood's sister, testified that Thomas went out to go to town about 11 p.m, wearing his white flannel jacket and white trousers that were his work clothes. He'd already been told by his mother-in-law to put a coat on, but he didn't. Anne said she was afraid something might happen to him. She tried to stop him going, but he wouldn't listen. So she went outside because she was worried. She said she kind of went outside the house and kind of piled up some bricks to try and look over and see what was happening. And then she heard somebody shout, "Damn you, what are you or who are you? Tell me or I'll shoot you." This was, of course, Smith. Next thing Anne Millwood hears is a gunshot. She ran out of the house and found her brother's dead body lying about 30 yards away. Smith had shot Millwood at very, very, very close range. The bird shot had then scattered all across Millwood's kind of face, jaw and neck, and because it had gone into his neck, it had managed to sever his spinal cord and kill him probably instantly. Smith then ran off to the White Hart pub, which is the one next door to where he lives, saying that he had shot something. The landlady tried to calm him down and sent a maid to go and fetch Girdler, the night watchman. Smith and Girdler then went back out to find out what had happened, and on the way they ran into John Locke and George Stowe, who'd been drinking in another pub. The four of them found Millwood's body using Girdler's lantern, and Smith went into shock. He immediately said he would give himself up, and John Locke persuaded him to go back to his lodgings and wait for arrest. So what they're going to do is go and fetch William Brooks, the High Constable, who will then go to Smith's home to arrest Smith. Smith appears to have immediately been horrified and extremely contrite about what he'd done. He certainly didn't mean to kill Millwood. What he thought he was doing, shooting a ghost, especially since it seems like a lot of people must have thought that this was just somebody dressing up. Which is not a capital offence, however annoying it might be. Whether Smith just didn't think he would actually kill somebody with this bird shooting gun, or whether he thought it was a demon or a ghost or something. His defence later in court is that he thought he was shooting a ghost. So he must have had an idea of a ghost that is more corporeal, or thought it was a demon or something like that. He's certainly extremely contrite immediately after it's happened. The Times reported that Anne Millwood had rushed out immediately and found her brother's body immediately. Much later, Mitchell in the Newgate Calendar says that she had tried to get her parents to come out first and then gone out on her own when they wouldn't come with her. It's written a heck of a lot later than the Times article, so maybe she ran out and then went back in to get her parents. But anyway, she then appears or is already there. Smith went home, Stowe went to get Millwood's father from the house, and also the constable, Brooks. And then they carried Millwood's body to the Black Lion, which was actually the nearest pub. Smith had presumably gone to the White Hart because that's where he lived, but the nearest pub to them was the Black Lion Inn. And then William Brooks, the constable, once they'd fetched him, went to Smith's lodgings, and Smith immediately gave himself up for arrest. It was common practice at the time to keep a body at the nearest pub while waiting for an inquest, which is why they've taken Millwood to the Black Lion Inn. Presumably this is just to do with the fact, the word pub actually means public house, and it's a public space. One imagines nobody particularly wants a dead body hanging around in their house. If you died at home, you would be kept at home for a little while. But if somebody's died out in the street, you don't necessarily want the body hanging around the house. And if there has to be an inquest, you also want somebody able to keep an eye on the body while you wait for the coroner, presumably. Anyway, it became common practice to take bodies to the nearest pub to await the coroner for an inquest. Hodgson, the coroner, came out on January 6th, which is also the date of the Times report on the case. He held an inquiry in the pub and had a surgeon look at the body, and they could see why Millwood had been killed with this bird shooting gun, because it was at such close range and it penetrated his neck. So a decision is very quickly made that Smith does indeed need to stand trial for this crime, and the trial happened very quickly. January 13th was the date of the trial. This is partly because of the seriousness of the crime. Smith had many witnesses to his good character at the trial who testified that he was not the type of person generally inclined to murder people, and that he had not intended anybody any harm. The jury initially found him guilty of manslaughter. Now, in British law, manslaughter is similar to third-degree murder in America, obviously not the same, these are different laws in different countries, but in British law, manslaughter is somebody has died, but that was not necessarily the intention of the killer. So, for example, if somebody is hit over the head in a fight and they die, the person who whacked them over the head clearly intended to hurt them, and they have killed them, but they didn't intend them to actually die. They intended to hurt them, they didn't intend to kill them. So in British law, that would be manslaughter. Murder is premeditated. So it doesn't have to be premeditated for very long. It can be as simple as you pick up a weapon and you kill someone with it, and picking up the weapon counts as premeditation. But it is premeditated to some extent, even if only by a few seconds. Murder is deliberately killing somebody. You set out to kill them. You intend for them to be dead when you've finished. So the jury found Smith guilty of manslaughter on the grounds that he thought he was shooting a ghost. However, the judge, Lord Chief Baron Archibald MacDonald, said there were no circumstances that could allow this crime to be reduced from murder to manslaughter. Manslaughter is obviously a serious but less serious crime than murder. The judge said Millwood was not trying to run away, so that would have reduced the sentence. If he was running away, I guess the implication would be he's committing some kind of crime, and it would be more justifiable then, I think is what the judge is thinking. The ghosts themselves hadn't actually hurt anyone. Aside from those rumours about a pregnant woman dying, which probably aren't even actually true, the ghost hasn't hurt anyone. They're just a nuisance. They're just jumping out at people and frightening them. They're not doing anything. They set some horses loose, which obviously, again, is a crime, but a considerably smaller one. And the judge said Smith went out into the night with a gun, looking to shoot somebody, and then he saw someone at close range who wasn't doing him any harm, wasn't running away, wasn't committing any kind of crime or threatening Smith in any way, and shot him. And the judge said this has to be murder. And then the jury did find him guilty of murder because they're really, at that point, there really are no more, there are no other ways to go with that once the judge had refused to accept the verdict of manslaughter. Smith was initially sentenced to be hanged, but he was pardoned by the Home Secretary and his sentence was changed to a year in prison. And then a few months later, he was actually pardoned by the King, which would at the time be George III. There were various points where George IV was acting as regent for his father, who was mentally ill, which is why this period is called the Regency. But the official Regency hasn't started yet. So presumably George III is the King. And he had Smith pardoned and freed. What made the case so complicated to resolve was the fact that Smith, according to him, genuinely believed that he was in danger, that this was an issue of self-defence, even though he was mistaken. So this issue of what do you do if somebody acts in good faith but takes violent action and turns out to be mistaken was something that wasn't really resolved until 1983, when the case of R.V. Williams came before the Court of Appeal. And the judges clarified the law, saying that in a case of self-defence, where self-defence or the prevention of crime is concerned, if the jury came to the conclusion that the defendant believed or may have believed that he was being attacked or a crime was being committed, and that force was necessary to protect himself or to prevent the crime, then the prosecution have not proved their case. If, however, the defendant's alleged belief was mistaken, and if the mistake was an unreasonable one, that may be a peaceful reason for coming to the conclusion that the belief was not honestly held and should be rejected. Even if the jury come to the conclusion that the mistake was an unreasonable one, if the defendant may genuinely have been labouring under it, he is entitled to rely upon it. Exactly what people in 1983 would have thought of the defence that you thought you were shooting a ghost is impossible to say. Around the same time as Smith's trial in mid-January, John Graham, the shoemaker, was also arrested. Graham had actually teased William Girdler for not managing to catch the ghost, but it turned out that the ghost on the 29th of December was John Graham. Graham's apprentices had been scratching the walls of his house and teasing his children with ghost stories. This is likely inspired, on the part of the apprentices, by the Cock Lane poltergeist, a very, very famous hoax ghost from a good 40-50 years earlier by this point. But the Cock Lane poltergeist, or Scratching Fanny, was a very, very famous hoax, which was supposedly haunted house in Cock Lane in London, and it turned out to be people kind of using various implements to scratch the walls and stuff. I've actually done a whole video on that already as well, so I'll link that below too. So Graham's apprentices, presumably inspired by Scratching Fanny, had been scratching the walls of the house and telling Graham's children that their house was haunted and upsetting the children. So on the 29th of December, Graham decided to get revenge by frightening the apprentices on their way home. He sent one of them out to walk home a visiting servant called Sarah Francis, and then he hid in a white blanket, or possibly a white sheet, and jumped out at the apprentice on the way back. But, of course, the apprentice ran into Girdler, and Girdler also spotted Graham pretending to be the ghost. And it was this that really prompted Francis Smith, and several other men as well, to go out looking for the ghost, or anyone pretending to be the ghost, over the next few nights. That and the £10 reward, to be fair. But this was a factor in Millward's death, basically, albeit not intentionally. In the end, Graham was let go because there was no crime to charge him with. Loitering with intent, I don't think was a crime. You could be prodded along by the watchman if you were kind of getting in the way, and especially if you were drunk. If you were disturbing the peace, you could be, moved along. But loitering with intent isn't really a crime in 1804. Graham has not done anything criminal to charge him with. But he ended up leaving the area of Hammersmith because everybody in the parish was deeply unimpressed with this behaviour. He actually only confessed to pretending to be the ghost on that specific night of the 29th of December. No one ever found an explanation for all of the other appearances of the ghost. Many of them sound like somebody dressing up. Some of them are clearly cases of mistaken identity. But no one ever came forward or was caught who had been pretending to be the ghost on any other nights. But the ghost's appearances did then stop after Graham's kind of almost not quite arrest. It did come back a few times over time. It reappeared in 1824 and very occasionally in later years. But the bulk of the appearances of the Hammersmith Ghost stopped with the trial of Francis Smith and the arrest of John Graham. It seems to me that there are at least 3 ghosts haunting Hammersmith in December 1803 and January 1804. One of them is Thomas Millward and the other people who just get mistaken for the ghost, women in white dresses, which are starting to become very fashionable in this period, by the way. Women in white dresses, Thomas Millward in his bricklayer's clothes, simply people walking around wearing pale clothing at night who have been mistaken for a ghost. And I think that's a big factor. I mean, Millward was mistaken 3 times, the third one fatally. It also seems to me that there is somebody dressing up as a ghost and freaking people out. Someone has cut loose the horses from the stagecoach earlier in December. John Graham confessed to dressing up as the ghost on the 29th of December. There was the other servant who deliberately dressed up in his female friend's clothing to kind of pretend to be a ghost. So there are quite a few people deliberately dressing up as a ghost to scare people, freak people out, by way of frolic, as the servant put it. And that seems to account for quite a lot of the appearances of the ghost as well. And of course, depending on your personal belief in the supernatural, there is the possibility of something genuinely strange going on. The ghost does originally start to appear not far from where Thomas Flynn, who died a violent death and did not get a kind of proper burial, according to his culture. He was buried not far from where it first started appearing. There is this tragic sequence of events leading up to the death of Millward, a lot of poor choices being made, depending on, what you personally believe is going on. There could have been something that kick-started it all. But in the end, it seems to have been mostly people dressing up and mistaken identity. Nowadays, there are stories of ghosts connected with the Black Lion Inn, as we have seen. If they have any connection to this story, one would imagine it's either Paul Millward or maybe Francis Smith with a guilty conscience. In 2004, the BBC reported that locals say the Hammersmith Ghost returns to the churchyard every 50 years, the last visit before 2004 being in July 1955. I haven't found anything more recent, but if you live in Hammersmith or have been to Hammersmith and you know anything about any more recent ghost stories associated with the Hammersmith Ghost and with Black Lion Lane and the Black Lion Inn, then please do let me know in the comments. The story of the Hammersmith Ghost is actually one of 8 stories I have retold in my new book, Creepy Classics Haunting Tales for Winter, which is currently on its way to be delivered to the house. So I'm going to hand over to later in the day, Jules, by which time it might quite possibly be dark, to tell you all about it. So when the books finally arrived yesterday evening, it had got quite late and I had stuff going on and I didn't manage to film the final part I needed to of the video. And then today I went to the hairdresser. So here I am, clearly on a completely different day with completely different hair, but the books arrived. Yay! Ooh! Oh no, I broke the box. Okay. I needed that to take them to the book fair. Never mind. Okay, here they are. So this is my latest short story collection, Creepy Classics, Haunting Tales for Winter. This takes you on a journey through haunted Christmases past from the Regency, I'm sitting under the bookcase, sorry, from Regency England through Reformation Scotland, medieval France, King Arthur's court, and all the way back to Viking Age Iceland, travelling back through time. The Arthurian legend one is just kind of plopped in there because it doesn't really have a time period, but the rest of them are in reverse chronological order. They are all haunting Christmas stories or around Christmas and New Year's. So the time period covered ranges from kind of November to February, but Christmas is kind of in there in each one. It's 7 short stories and 1 novella, and they are all inspired by stories from the time period, medieval and early modern ghost stories that I have rewritten. The first one is the story of the Hammersmith Ghost. I have retold it as a fictional story. I focus on events leading up to the death of Thomas Millward. I don't go into the kind of murder case and the trial and stuff because I'm focusing on it as a ghost story. So it's focusing on the events leading up to his death. And then we have a whole bunch of other stories, including the cover story, which is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And then the novella at the back is The Hauntings at Frodeswater, which is inspired by a Viking Age Icelandic saga. And it has revenants and witchcraft and weird seals' heads and plague and drowned men and all sorts of things. If you would like to support the channel, it really does help if you are able to pick up one of my books in ebook or paperback. The other 2 are, of course, also still available. That is Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Rome and Ghost Stories from Ancient Greece, inspired by Greek and Roman ghost stories. Or if you prefer listening to stories, most of the stories in the books were already told on my podcast, Creepy Classics. There is 1 book exclusive story in each book, but the rest of them, if you prefer to listen, you can listen to them for free on the podcast. And now back to Jules from yesterday to finish off. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. It really does help boost it in the algorithm. If you'd like to support the channel, of course, you can buy one of my books or some merch, which is available from my website, which I will link below. I've got various bits and pieces for sale there. But any like, share, subscribe, comment, any of that all helps. And thank you so much for watching. Until next time, bye. Is that you, doggy dog? I got a doggy visitor. Hello. Middle of filming.
Sorry.
Little doggy visitor. Hello. Hello. Hello, good boy. You comfy?